Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Well, the 1933 debate caused great distress, but whether it caused quite as much as we now are told is doubtful. Even Winston Churchill, who obviously disapproved of pacifism and defeatism in 1933, could only come up with the fact that a friend of his, Lord Lloyd, had been told that Mussolini had pondered the debate seriously. Well, whether Mussolini's intervention mattered very much to any of us, I doubt. I can't really contradict what we've just heard, because of course it's something that everybody agrees with. War is hell. Many things change from the moment war is declared for particular reasons obtaining at the time. War itself changes everything. These are truisms which I imagine every sensible person accepts. But what I don't accept is that all wars are wrong, or indeed in human history that all of everything is either right or wrong. It's far, far more complicated than that. And I certainly don't accept, for example, the fantasies of history which suggest that the Great War was fought for nothing except for a few arms merchants to benefit themselves. They've obviously not studied how the Germans behaved when they entered Belgium. They've not studied what happened when von Falkenhayn annexed Romania. They've not understood. Have you studied these things? That's my question, because that's what I'm talking about. You have, I take it.
I'd like to ask about the conduct of Belgium at the time in the Congo, which is always forgotten about.
I can't get taken off into digressions like that, as obviously it's wholly irrelevant. It happened well before the Great War took place, and the Great War had nothing to do with the Congo. There is a whole chapter, but more importantly is that people then did not share the wonderful views in films like Oh, What a Lovely War. The people who fought the Great War, of course you can't generalize that much, but the fact is that in general people were prepared. Indeed, they couldn't have fought for 4 years unless they believed that it was a war that needed fighting. And we had to fight Prussian militarism, otherwise France would definitely have gone under, Russia would have collapsed next, and we'd have been faced across the Channel with an almighty jackbooted power which would be determined on attacking Britain next. We effectively had no choice. Belgium, of course, being neutral, we acted honourably because we'd guaranteed Belgian neutrality in 1839 and were prepared to fight for it. But of course, that was not the prime reason for the war. The war was fought because Germany was an almighty aggressive power, no less than it was in World War II. In World War II, of course, Germany piled on further iniquities to its record, and we had all the more reason to fight. But what I'm saying is we're not here to study particular wars, but all wars, of course, are different. But the motion of the idea of fighting for queen and country, of course, is being taken grotesquely over literally by the other side. Of course, people go in. When I joined the army in long distant days, we didn't hate the Soviet. Well, I hated the Soviet Union, but I don't think any of my friends did. They hated. We were quartered at Weems Barracks in Canterbury, and they hated the Inniskillen Dragoons and the East Surreys and the Royal Fusiliers who were quartered with us a great deal more. I don't think they even thought about the Soviet Union. And of course, when soldiers are in battle, some behave badly and cruelly, some behave chivalrously, they become involved in terrible things, some behave disgracefully towards civilians. All these things happen, so we all know, we don't need to be told, it's obvious that war is a cruel, horrible thing. But sometimes the war has to be fought. Obviously the last war had to be fought, unless somebody can seriously think that we'd have been better off under Nazi occupation. I don't think anybody who actually was living under Nazi occupation would share that view, and their view, of course, I should have thought they were entitled to hold. And again, a sort of strange diatribes against the poor Duke of Edinburgh, who actually fought in the last war very, very bravely against an iniquitous enemy, who then makes chance odd remarks. I couldn't see that any of them was that evil. He seemed to be treated as if he were a war criminal, but if we were all denounced for the remarks made in constant contacts with members of the public and having to dream up something to say, we'd all probably be imprisoned too, but I don't think we'd deserve it. Pacifism is not the answer. It is obviously fighting for peace and extolling peace is very important, and we should, but peace isn't an abstract that can be achieved like that. It has to be achieved by practical purposes. As my friend Rory Stewart said, you know, we take recent occasions. There are wars some wars quite wrong. I don't need to be told by the other side that the invasion of Iraq, supported by initiated by Blair and strongly supported by Cameron, was, in my view too, an iniquitous war. It was not fought for honourable reasons. It was not fought for anything that affected the interests of this country. It caused untold and cruelty and suffering, and still is doing so. The war in Afghanistan, it seems to me, is perfectly similar, that our troops should be sent out. And indeed, how many of our politicians, did you and Blair join the army? How many of our politicians have actually got sons serving in the armed forces? I remember the film about Michael Moore about the invasion of Iraq, and he actually stood outside Congress with a microphone interviewing congressmen and representatives, saying, have you got a son in the military? Not one in the film could answer. They're pretty careful. That wasn't always the case. Certainly in the Great War and the World War II, if you polled the House of Commons or the House of Lords, even more perhaps, you'd have found that, I guess I haven't got the statistics, that a majority had their sons serving. Many people who'd served in the Great War, one forgets how close together they were, served again in the Second World War. They weren't people like Field Marshal Alexander. They didn't love war. I remember Nigel Nicholson telling me he'd been intelligence officer in the Coldstream Guards, and he was came up holding an advanced post in North Africa, and suddenly a jeep drew up with a cloud of sand, and out stepped the Field Marshal Alexander himself with a couple of staff officers, and he came up, and near them was lying the corpse of a dead German. And Alexander looked, and he looked at Nigel Nicholson, and he said, "War's a dirty business, isn't it?" Well, Alexander had fought with the Irish Guards right through the Great War. He was so brave that it was said that his soldiers would step in his footsteps because they felt he was invulnerable and if they would be safe if they did the same. These people didn't go into war blindly. Okay, no doubt there were. Obviously, you can't fight a war without armaments, and some of the dealers in arms are no doubt thinking about profits. I'm sure they do. But to say that is only why wars are fought is just to fly in the whole face of history and of human experience. Who are these cynical people, usually played by Claude Rains in pre-war films? Do you actually meet people? They exist, I know, there are cynical people, but most people have much more complicated motives than that. Sometimes we have to fight a war. That we fight it in the name of Queen and country, obviously, is a convention. It's actually, in the case of the monarch, it's a very convenient convention. You have to have someone in whose name war is declared, for example. I think I'm right in saying that we didn't declare war in Iraq or Afghanistan, did we? We went aggressively to war without doing it, which is yet another reason why there were such appalling, in the case of Afghanistan, such appalling wars. Troops are still being sent out to be killed. I totally agree with what the other side is saying. But they don't fight literally for the Queen. Some people probably would. When I was joined the army, it was at the year of the coronation. I think I wasn't alone in being desperately in love with the Queen. She was very beautiful. And I can remember when I was a simple private of the Buffs, in my tin cupboard by my bed, I'd fallen in love, I did at 18, every other week with a different film star. And there was a lovely one called Anne Vernon, a French girl, who was with a film I'd seen with David Niven. So I had a lovely picture of her inside. Corporal Martin opened the cabinet, saw this. He said, "Private Tolstoy, you know, you're not allowed to have that there. Take that, you're not allowed pin-ups, take it down." So I did. But then about a fortnight later, I'd fallen in love with the Queen. So I cut out a picture out of Illustrated and put that in there. And Corporal Martin noticed the door was closed, so he said, "Open it up." When the inspection came, I opened it up, and he looked at the picture of his commander-in-chief, and he looked at me, and he said, "You're bloody cunning, Tolstoy." Well, I wasn't really cunning, like most people then. I was fond of the Queen, but we were being trained, obviously. Britain had a colossal army then. We were being trained for potential war. My friends older friends had been fighting in Korea. I think of a necessary war, probably, that one. But we fought for these other things. But you have to have some symbol. And a monarch who has not played any part in provoking the war in general terms. I never heard that King George VI helped to provoke World War II, or King George V provoked the Great War. You need a symbol, and what better symbol than one who was not chosen by popular vote and who's one of a political faction, but one who represents the entire nation and its history. In our case, the Queen's ancestors go right back, famous through history, to the time of Alfred the Great and even earlier. And this is part of our shared history. It doesn't belong to any political party. If a political party boasts that the Queen belongs to them, they'd be shot down in a trice. The same with our country. We have a vision of our country, but it's a rather vague vision which varies from person to person. But nevertheless, I had occasion, my military career was brief and inglorious, but writing several books about the last war, some 20 or 30 years ago, I had to interview hundreds of British soldiers of all ranks who had served in that war. I was interviewing them to find specific information about what I was writing about, but I encouraged them to speak about their experiences in general. And in general, their feeling was that they'd fought a good and just war. And I remember one chap here, I forget his name now, he was a senior man in the Forestry Commission when I interviewed him, and he said, I remember, people often say war is hell. Well, he said, it is hell, of course. He said, I fought right through from 1939 to 1945, but actually, I have to tell you, I rather enjoyed it. I mean, we were comrades, we had the exhilaration, we felt we were doing a good job, a necessary job for our country. He said, there were only 2 times when I actually felt horror that I recall. One was when I was the first British officer with his unit to enter Belsen, and the other was a year later when I was detailed to send a group of Russian refugees in a camp to send them back to the Soviet Union, where I and my commanding officers knew perfectly well that they would be thrown into gulag camps and die miserable deaths. So we're not at all justifying iniquitous wars. In fact, we would oppose them. The war may be, no one can hold the Queen responsible for the horrors that go on in Afghanistan or did go on in Iraq. Our lovely politicians, Cameron and Blair, made no attempt to declare war. They violated the Geneva Convention on every side. But how this can be laid and blamed on devotion to Queen and country, insofar as that plays a realistic part, I simply can't understand. In 1933, there was, as I recall, similar debate held in the Cambridge Union, of which my father was president at the time. He was not very keen on the communists and pacifists who were there, fairly prevalent, as one tends to forget now, in the 30s, and certainly were in the debate here in 1933. But then, of course, he'd actually escaped from Russia. He knew what was going on there, where gradually Stalin was beginning to kill millions and millions of people. And this was total pacifism is not the best approach. Indeed, I'll end by quoting, which many people will be familiar with, Hilaire Belloc's little distich. Pale Ebenezer thought it wrong to fight, but Roaring Bill, who killed him, thought it right.